welcome to Trip the Beltway Fantastic. This past weekend at the Munich Security Conference, it would be an understatement to say that sparks were flying or even fireworks, more like bombs going off. It started last week when Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth said that Ukraine would not be given membership in NATO in any peace agreement, and said NATO's European members would have to provide the lion's share of funding for their defense. On the sidelines, the U.S. set the stage for direct meetings with Russia and Saudi Arabia, which took place on Tuesday, seemingly cutting Europe and Ukraine out. The BBC came to the conclusion that, quote, after this week, the post-World War II security architecture for Europe is no more. America is still in NATO, but Europe can no longer automatically rely on the U.S. to come to its aid. There seems to be some recognition of this in remarks by NATO Secretary Mark Rutte, who said in response to some of the teeth gnashing and garment rending at the confab, quote, to my European friends, I would say, get into the debate, not by complaining that you might, yes or no, be at the table, but by coming up with concrete proposals, ideas, ramp up defense spending, end quote. That seemed to be the spirit of the Paris summit on Monday as well. So here to talk about NATO and European partners and how they're reacting to this are two scholars who have been quite adamant all along that the NATO alliance has not only outlived its Cold War mission, but in its desperation to remain relevant has actually escalated the conflict that it is supposedly providing or wanting to provide more security for today, namely Ukraine. So please welcome Sumantra Mitra, the author of The Sources of Russian Aggression, Is Russia a Realist Power? And a 2023 policy brief entitled Pivoting the U.S. Away from Europe to a Dormant NATO. And also Justin Logan, who is the Director of Defense and Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. He published a 2023 brief, Uncle Sucker, Why U.S. Efforts at Defense Burden Sharing Fail. Consequently, Pete Hegseth used that term in his remarks to NATO last week, saying, quote, make no mistake, President Trump will not allow anyone to turn Uncle Sam into Uncle Sucker. So thanks, guys, for joining me today. I really appreciate it. I wanted to turn to you, Justin, first. What was your reaction to Hegseth's comments about NATO and the resulting outcry in Europe and in Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, I mean, it was somewhat edifying. I would say up and down the comments that Hegseth made were a lot of just sort of elementary common sense. As Sumantra and I and you know, the United States has been assiduously pressuring European allies to say that Ukraine will become a member of NATO, while behind the scenes blocking Ukraine from becoming a member of NATO. This is a sort of, to a simple country political scientist like myself, disingenuous, right? It's a little shady even. And so Hegseth had the temerity to say, we don't think that's a good idea. I mean, Joe Biden said, we're not going to fight Russia over Ukraine. Donald Trump said, we're not going to fight Russia over Ukraine. The idea that you would make a paper commitment implying that you would fight Russia over Ukraine after having demonstrated in the breach that you won't do so, and having two consecutive presidents say that they won't do so, strikes me as just sort of bizarre. And so Hegseth said some things that, the Europeans and John Bolton, but I repeat myself, didn't like very much. But that were just like elementary common sense. And so that was a real shot across the bow to the sort of transatlantic community that fancies itself somehow divorced from politics, both in the United States and in European countries.
Sumantra, how counterproductive is it that, as Justin said, there have been 2 years long war in which behind the scenes, everyone has acknowledged that Ukraine can't be in NATO, but never said, quote unquote, the quiet part out loud. Now Hegseth is saying it, but this is almost 3 years now into the war. How counterproductive has that sort of little tap dancing around reality been in terms of like prolonging the war, or at least hurting Ukraine in its sort of positioning for negotiations ahead.
Yeah, I think it's well, I think Justin mentioned rightly. I mean, this is a weird dance that the Europeans and the Americans like doing. It is nothing is monocausal in foreign policy, so you can't really like say like this is the person. Like there's the same chain of causality, but they're both kind of responsible. The Americans obviously prolonged the war, which is completely understandable. But there has also been scenarios when the Americans were trying to wrap things up, and the British, for example, pushed for a continuation of a conflict, or the Ukrainians themselves changed their tactics, for example, to invite more aggression. Like the entire, going inside Russia, that wasn't an American idea, that was a Ukrainian idea. And the entire, I mean, again, this is something which no one will be able to prove because we are not privy to the internal deliberations of the Ukrainian Strategic Council. But it can be understood what their motivation is, because to their mind, if they can, shift the boundaries of war, and it can show that they're gaining some kind of foothold inside Russia, there is a pressure that builds up in DC. Ultimately, obviously, the structural forces are going to come into play. I think it is quite clear, as all of us know here, that NATO doesn't want to go. They don't want to go to war. The Americans don't want to go to war. This weird song and dance of the Europeans saying like we are the adults and we have to be in the table. I think one of the master stroke in the last few days was sending that letter to the European capitals for two reasons. One, Hegseth said what he had to say in Brussels. JD Vance said what he had to say in Munich Security Conference. But fundamentally, there is this idea in Europe, like they don't really understand. They always think that, the Americans are going to come and say something, and then Senator Lindsey Graham will come to the Munich Security Conference and say like, yeah, we are all allies and nothing is going to change, and they're going to believe that. That changed the moment that letter was sent to all European capitals, and they asked that, okay, fine, you want to be the adults on the table, what do you bring? And at that point of time, the reality came to the forefront, because no one in Europe actually wants to go to war with Russia. Everyone knows that. So all this bluff was called, and I think that was the most clarifying moment of the new dimension. And now it's on the Americans to say, like, fine, we gave you an opportunity, you're not taking it, so we're going to do the hegemonic peace thing as we do hegemonic peace, and only this time you are going to be on the receiving side.
So they meet in Paris, the European leaders, on Monday, ostensibly to talk about how they will be able to provide for their own defense, but also perhaps stand up forces for Ukraine if necessary. And it seemed to me that there were mixed messages coming out of that so-called summit. You had UK and France were pretty ambitious and confident that they could bring to bear troops that would form a sort of European army. But then other leaders, I believe Germany and Poland, were not so sure about what they could contribute. Justin, when it comes down to it, and Europe says, okay, we got to take matters into our own hands, which Macron has said time and again since the first Trump administration, what do they have? Like, what are the challenges that they face when they do begin to try to distance themselves from the dependency that they have on the United States?
Well, I mean, the challenges are enormous, right? They have the problem of political will. Their populations don't want to fight Russia in Ukraine. They have a problem of capabilities. They spend more than the Russians spend on military power, but there are all sorts of redundancies and weird inefficiencies if you look at Europe as a sort of contiguous unit. There are too many armies, too many navies. The navies themselves are not effectively, there are a lot of redundancies there, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think you've seen what you've always seen during these moments of transatlantic duress, which is that rhetoric outstrips behavior, right? Macron says, in a speech, I think at the Sorbonne in the last year, Europe can die, right? So that's highfalutin rhetoric, right? If you're talking about state death, let alone Europe itself dying, you would expect to see some extraordinary measures being undertaken. And then when the principals get to the bargaining table, they're like, well, Germany's going on about the debt break, which in fairness, they have sort of let off. You can't let off the gas on a break. I'm mixing metaphors, but they've sort of relaxed a little bit with their maniacal obsession with debt. But this rhetoric behavior gap is still quite big. And the one thing that I would point to that I think was quite telling is, Poland has an understandable mania about Russia, about the Russian threat, and wants, an infinite amount of American attention dedicated to that problem. But you heard first the Polish defense minister and then the Polish head of state both say, we ain't sending troops to Ukraine to keep the peace. Our job is to defend, and Sumatra and I will both get hives when I say this, NATO's eastern flank. Of course, it's not a flank, it's the front. If it were the flank, then the front would need to be up north to the south. But the Poles, who are really anti-Russian, have said, no, we're not doing this. And I think that's just a reflection of the fact that they realize that the Americans aren't doing this. The entire premise and the cuteness, I think, of Macron, for a while, the Poles until this week, was to say, oh, sure, we might send peacekeepers in the long and I think ignominious tradition of so-called tripwires, right? Which is that, yes, the Washington Treaty makes clear that NATO troops are not covered by Article 5 if they're outside NATO territory. There were a lot of debates about this when there were all sorts of particularly French colonial possessions overseas, and the treaty was lawyered up to say, hey, wait a minute, fellas, we're not going to defend your colonies here. But the Poles have said, no, we're going to defend Poland here. And I think, the entire idea of European non-NATO peacekeepers in Ukraine was predicated on the idea that, in Thomas Schelling's words, when he originally wrote this, right, their job would be to die heroically in large numbers so as to create a political gravitational pull. Now I'm getting away from Schelling's exact wording, but you get the idea, that would pull in the Americans. And when the Americans say, we ain't doing that, then all of a sudden the idea collapses because everybody knows that the Europeans aren't going to put sufficient numbers of forces in being in Ukraine to actually keep the peace themselves. They would be a tripwire to pull in the Americans, and the Americans have said, and I hope continue to say, not happening, guys.
Sumatra, is the whole conversation about peacekeepers premature? I mean, can you talk a little bit about how we got there? Because I'm seeing little snippets on the news now about China might be willing to put troops into Ukraine, and other global South nations might be willing to form up this peacekeeping force. How did we get to peacekeeping force? Like, can you kind of put it in the context as why that's become an issue? Is it just what Justin says? It's kind of this sort of gravitational pull to sort of warn the United States that they need to be at the ready because, shit can break out at any moment, and it's more of a tripwire than anything else. Like, how do we get here in this conversation?
Yeah, so the short answer to the question is there is a segment within NATO who are constantly talking about putting troops on the ground, including the Baltics, Poland, even France. Like France, not to mention, like they want to send troops to Greenland, they want to send troops to Gaza, they want to send troops everywhere in Ukraine, which is very odd. Justin and I, and we obviously cannot mention the details, but we were in a meeting with a bunch of European diplomats and think tankers, and they all talk about this idea of sending troops as if, they talk about tripwire. And the only question I once asked them, like, you do realize that if the wire is tripped, there is no one to come to save you. Because that, as he mentioned, like, this is, the moment you take away the Article 5, first of all, if you're sending troops somewhere else, and if that troop is wiped off in a different context, Article 5 probably won't apply anyway. Second of all, even if it does, Article 5 only asks the countries to come together and discuss things before they take a decision, and then that goes to the US Congress and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, the Europeans don't really understand that. So they had this idea that in the Balkan situation, for example, they had the K4 troops, which was again backstopped by the Americans. So at the end of the day, the muscle was, the idea was predicated on, on the Americans coming to save them if something bad happens. The moment that card was taken off the table, this entire thing collapsed. This idea collapsed. Now, obviously, there could be a situation. As we discussed before, and separately, like there are essentially two models of peacekeeping. One where you can have a ceasefire, have a fixed day, you move troops off, and then you kind of like decide. It happened in Korean War, happened in the First World War. That's one model where you have a ceasefire. From what we can see, the Trump administration favors that model. You have a fixed date of ceasefire. It gives a easy win to the Trump administration. The president can go and say like, yeah, I stopped the war. Anyway, the second model is the Balkan model, which is what the Europeans want to do because they want to be part of this, post-order security in Ukraine. The problem is they don't have the muscle to back it up. Now, they might favor an idea where they are patrolling the troops right next to the Russians, like they did in Pristina. But again, the main variable in this thing is the American muscle and the American nuclear guarantee and the Article 5, and all of those things are taken away. So to answer your question, it originally started with the Baltics and France, and then obviously it got spread. And for some reason, they thought that it would be like Article 5 and the Americans would come into play. But clearly that has been taken off the table.
Yeah. Well, how about this issue, just shifting away for a moment to the peace talks, or at least the opening of talks in Saudi Arabia between Russian and United States leaders that occurred on Tuesday. Europeans are, like I said, gnashing of teeth, rending of clothes, that they had not been invited to the table. Same with Ukraine. There's lots of words like betrayal flung around. I saw that as an opening gambit, not a carve out, so to speak, of these two other parties. Justin, can you talk a little bit about the European and Ukrainian reaction to the Saudi talks, and what are your thoughts about how things have progressed so quickly since the inauguration on this front?
Yeah, I mean, I'm tempted here to sort of tap my fingertips together and do my best German accent a la Henry Kissinger and say, power is the ultimate ratio of international politics. And, I think the Europeans have struggled with this, right? They say we have norms and we have regulations and we have rules and we have all these wonderful things that we contribute to international politics. And the Americans just walked away, right? Which is like the least unpredictable, the easiest to predict reality here, which is that you're short on power, you're short on influence, right? I mean, anybody in domestic politics will tell you the same thing. The Ukrainians are hot and bothered, as you would expect them to be. And, again, the Europeans are left sort of looking around like, John Travolta in Pulp Fiction, what happened here, because we've engaged in this fiction where NATO is 32 members, all of whose interests and values weigh equally, et cetera, et cetera. And, the Trump administration has made clear what was clear to many of us for a long time, which was that this was always a fiction, right? The Baltic states together have 0 main battle tanks. They have armed forces that resemble in quantity the NYPD with less firepower. So the idea that we're going to weigh their influence on the highest of high politics, right? This is diplomacy with the world's largest nuclear weapons state, which views itself in a proxy war with the most powerful military on the face of the earth on its own border. And the idea that we would weigh the prerogatives of Kaja Kallas and her comrades in the Baltic states equally to the well-being of regular people in the Midwest of the United States is absolutely deranged. And so I think the Trump administration very sensibly has laid bare this myth that we're going to take the prerogatives of these states into equal account as the well-being of our own people. And I think it has been tremendously refreshing and I hesitate to use the phrase common sense, but it's kind of common sense that we would put our own interests before the interests of our clients. So I think that, the Europeans and particularly the Ukrainians are really ticked off right now, as they probably should be. And then it'll take a long, hard look in the mirror to think about what to do next.
But if we are truly committed to a peaceful resolution in this war, Europeans are going to have to be brought in on the talks at some point. I mean, you're not saying that it's just the US and Russia just got to figure this out, and then we will present something to Europe and it's got to deal with it. I feel like I said, this is an opening gambit. We got to figure out what Russia is willing to give, what their demands are, establish our own relations and relationship with Russia, and then there will be a next step. This idea that they won't have a place at the table forever seems kind of silly. I mean, in order to stabilize the situation, that's their part of the world.
Sure, and they're welcome. I would encourage a much more robust European defense expenditure, a much more robust European role in Europe. My view is that U.S. aid to Ukraine, U.S. involvement in Ukraine in any form should be calibrated perfectly to the U.S. interest in Ukraine, not to the NATO interest in Ukraine, not to Estonia's interest in Ukraine, not to Poland's interest in Ukraine. And it happens to be the case that the United States military aid to Ukraine is what has allowed it to survive thus far. And if that's the case, and I believe it is, then our interest has a tremendous amount of sway in terms of what can be produced politically and militarily inside Ukraine. And the administration should be absolutely unapologetic about our aid being calibrated to our interest, and our interest as being very much not identical with the Ukrainian interest, and indeed not identical to the Polish or even the French interest in Ukraine.
Sumatra, what do you say about all that?
Yeah, look, it's the reason the Americans are talking directly to the Russians are twofold. One, it is not that the Americans would not want to get the Europeans be a part of the equation, but the Europeans, what are the Europeans going to bring to the table anyway? They are quite absolutely capable of post-war reconstruction. If the Europeans were actually smart, they would have said, fine, it's the Americans and Russians figuring out a new equilibrium in Ukraine. What we're going to do is we're going to scoop up all their minerals and help them reconstruct, and our companies are going to benefit. But they are so ideologically invested in this conflict, and they've kind of like swallowed their own idea of Russian hegemonic threat. And again, this is a classic case of too many cooks. I mean, part of the reason the Congress of, the Concert of Europe worked is because even though there were a whole bunch of people, there were essentially three people who were discussing the peace: Talleyrand, Metternich, and Castlereagh. Fundamentally, diplomacy is an elite game. You can have a whole bunch of people, but no one really cares about what a Portuguese count has to say during the Concert of Europe. And likewise, no one really cares about what Lithuania has to say now. That being said, I do agree that I think hegemonic peace could be done a bit more deftly. And I also do think we have to understand that the Russians are the Russians. They would try and probe your boundaries. There would come a situation where, say, for example, purely as a tabletop simulation, if tomorrow there is a ceasefire date and the Russians said, fine, we are going to move our troops out, but in return, the Ukrainians have to move out of Russia from Kursk and go back to Ukraine. What if the Ukrainians say that we don't want to do that? At that point of time, are we going are we going to put pressure on the Ukrainians? How? Are we going to bomb them? Yeah. Are we going to push them away? There is some Ukrainian mischief agency, which I think we need to just be cognizant that even now, with all things considered, things might go south because there are multiple parties who are aggrieved. And as to your final point about the stab in the back, that was inevitable. Anyone who studied history would have seen that coming. In fact, if genuinely it's a worry that Zelensky's, position might be untenable, part of the reason why the Ukrainian right wing tolerates Zelensky is because they are getting what they wanted to do. The moment that stops, there would be some pressure, and we probably wouldn't like it. We have an entire country which is decimated, a heavily armed population, and an extreme strong far-right movement. It might not be a threat to America, but it is a lot of destabilization quotient in that region. So we have to be careful as to what's coming. Europeans have to take a part in stabilizing the peace even after that happens.
And I think it's not just Ukraine, right? Like my view of this conflict, I'm coded as anti-Ukraine and all the rest of it. I think it's the basic reality of living next to a large, ambitious neighbor, right? There's a famous Mexican writer, Porfirio Diaz, who had a great line about the Mexican predicament. And he said, "Poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States." Right? And this is kind of the Mexican experience of living next to the United States. It sucks, right? Like it's not, your prerogatives don't get a lot of say. And I think that this war in large part was about Russia wanting to preserve the ability to bully its neighbor. Now, it's not going to bully its neighbor every day of the week. It's not going to bully its neighbor maybe the majority of years in a century. But it wants the ability to do that, just like all great powers in the history of international politics have wanted the ability to do that. So if what we're after here is preventing Russia's ability to bully Ukraine, I have bad news, right? Russia is going to be able to bully Ukraine till the dawn of time. I mean, I just don't understand how, the Americans have had in their minds this idea that we're going to transcend the most powerful secular forces in international politics. The first of which is geography, economics, population size, military size. I mean, it just sucks living next to a large, ambitious, great power. And so if what we're trying to get to is a place where Russia can't bully Ukraine, we're not going to get there.
I mean, I want to add one single thing though. Like sometimes in diplomacy, when you're looking for peace, like if you read some of the literature on peace, building, the one way of looking for peace is to guarantee the rights of the minority party in this situation, in this case, Ukraine. The other way to look for peace is to satiate the bigger neighbor. One of the things that also the Europeans and the Americans need to consider and figure out is the Russians act in a certain way because they feel in a certain way. What are their feelings and what might be? It might not be just, and there might be a lot of negotiations, but there might be a situation where you can reach some sort of a negative peace and equilibrium. After all, the Cold War was fundamentally peaceful in Europe. There were every chance of that going away, badly for both sides. But it didn't, because by the 1970s, both sides figured out that these are the red lines and these are the ways that the other side can be satiated. Something like that in a local, or a more limited way could be done in Ukraine.
Do you think that those, I'm putting a lot of stock in the Trump administration officials who are now speaking with their Russian counterparts, but do you think that that's the goal of these opening talks, is to find out what is possible and then take it to Ukraine and say, okay, this is what the Russians want. What are you willing to do? And then ask for a ceasefire. This is an honest question, because it sounds like establishing a ceasefire or calling a ceasefire without the Ukrainian buy-in would probably be a recipe for failure. What would be the next step after these talks, if successful, between the U.S. and Russia? Do they go to Ukraine? Do they involve them? Do they get them to the table, get a ceasefire on the books, and then do all the hard work of establishing an agreement for a long-term peace?
So the U.S. and the Russian side had contacts even during the roughest days of the war. It's not like there was no contact at all. There were like track-to diplomacies going on. Richard Haas, for example, traveled and wrote a whole bunch of stuff. Actually, interestingly enough, he's far closer to the Trumpian position that he would let out to be. Fundamentally, the two things that he mentioned is, like, one, there has to be some kind of territorial concession from the Ukrainian side. That is already happening. And the second thing, he actually mentioned that, look, at the end of the day, the Americans can stop the war by just stopping, aid and weapons to Ukraine. And that is also kind of happening. So Hasn't happened so far, but like the threat is already there. Like, look, we are talking to the Russians because we want peace, and you have to listen to us. The higher level contacts weren't there because of optics, because of ideology, because Biden's brain was goulash. There were, a whole bunch of stuff, a whole bunch of reasons. So there were no higher level contacts. And clearly, the American administration wants to figure out what the Russian red lines are. They are, I am hoping, cognizant that the Russian side would also start from an extremely maximalist position, because that is just how negotiations happen. It's not like if the Russians tomorrow say that, yeah, our position is like NATO should move back to pre-1996 borders, that's not what they believe either. That's just how they want to start talking. So hopefully the American side knows that. I'm pretty sure they do. And then comes the situation as to like, okay, fine, these are the Russian red lines officially declared. And here is the timeline of how the thing would be stopped. So there's going to be a ceasefire. There's going to be all the primary, determinants and, deliverables and what are they called? Confidence building measures and those kind of stuff. It's very, Pentagonese, but like it's all those kind of things are going to happen. And then after that, once that stays for at least a year, a couple of years, then we can figure out how to move forward and make it permanent. So at this point of time, it's going to be very slow. But the stage is finding out what the Russians actually want. And some of the things that you're going to read in the media are going to be absolute insane, because that's just how, interactions start.
Yeah. And things get leaked. I heard or read in tweets this morning or posts on X that the Russians wanted Ukrainian elections, like within a year or something like that. And I don't even know if that's true, but I feel like the rumors are flying already, the leaks from the talks and whatnot. And I think because things are happening so rapidly, we need to take a deep breath and trust but verify, as they say. So we've run out of time, but thank you so much for joining me on Trip the Beltway. Fantastic. Justin, we find all your work at Cato. Where's the best place, Sumantra, to find your work? I know you have your book. You can easily Google that. But in terms of your writings, where's the best place to find you? But you're on mute.
Sorry, technologically.
Well, this is important.
I'm like the only Indian heritage guy who's not good with computers. So you can find some of my essays and research papers in the Center for Reading America, where I'm a senior fellow.
Fantastic. Okay, well, thank you both, and I hope you'll return to the show as all these things are happening so quickly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.